for making these colloquia possible. Matthew, thanks to you too, in absentia, for all you've done for the center and before emotion in particular. And let me also extend my thanks to Anna Donch, the program administrator for the NYU Center for Ancient Studies, whose work behind the scenes has been both integral and indispensable for the present colloquium. Since Matthew was going to introduce me, I had best say a word about myself and my role as co-organizer of this colloquium, along with Curie Virag, whom I will introduce properly tomorrow when she will be chairing the session. I'm professor of classics at NYU, and I have been interested in ancient Greek and Roman emotion concepts for some decades now. I published a book back in 2006 called The Emotions of the Ancient Greeks, Studies in Aristotle and Classical Literature. I have come over the years since that time to believe that Aristotle was indeed responsible for the way we think about and classify the emotions today, even though his views of particular emotions, as we shall see in a moment, do not always correspond neatly to our own. But that's enough about me. Now let's proceed to our topic. The word further in the title of our colloquium refers to the fact that this is the second round of talks on this topic. It's the successor to the first edition, which took place almost exactly a year ago in November of 2022. In that earlier session, we considered the nature of emotion and emotions as they were expressed and experienced in 6 different classical cultures: ancient Greece and Rome, China, India, primarily with a view to Sanskrit, Hebrew, and Arabic. This year, we are following up with 6 new traditions, or rather, very old traditions, but new to our colloquium. These include Sumerian, Akkadian, Hittite, Egyptian, Mayan, and Japanese. And once again, we will hear from experts in each of these linguistic areas about how emotions and the very idea of emotion were conceived. Well, so much for the word further. But what about the word before, in before emotion? Was there a time when there was no emotion, or at least no concept or term that corresponds to the way we think of emotions today? Well, yes, it turns out that the idea of emotion as a special faculty or category in our psychic makeup is not necessarily universal. We learned last year, for example, that there is no word in biblical Hebrew that embraces fear, anger, love, and so forth under a single concept. In other words, no term that means emotion generally, as opposed to individual emotions. And after all, why should we have imagined the case to be otherwise? Is it really so obvious that shame, hatred, pity, anger, and fear all belong together like the fingers on our hand? As historians, we're accustomed to comparing and contrasting the concepts, even the most basic ones, in different societies. We have histories of childhood, for example, that show that stages of maturation were differently conceived in other times and places. Recent work has shown that notions of gender are not uniform across all cultures. Indeed, even so elementary and apparently physical an experience as that of color varies from one society to another. There is in modern Welsh a word that covers the entire spectrum of what we think of as blue, yellow, and green. One term is gla for all of this. And if this seems strange, we might reflect on the fact that the Latin word for yellow, or straw-colored, namely flavus, is cognate with the English blue. Somewhere back in time, there was a term, evidently, that had the same range as the Welsh word, and it later split into yellow at one end and blue at the other. And if this is the case with color, why not with emotion, a far more ethereal concept? Emotions, in other words, are not just fixed and unchanging things, guaranteed to be the same everywhere by virtue of evolution or whatever. No, they too, like color and childhood and gender and much else, have a history, and even a prehistory. And that is what we are here to explore today and tomorrow. Well, let me say a word on how we came to think about the prehistory of emotion, if I may call it that. We are now seeing emotions at the center of a wide range of disciplines to an extent that hasn't been witnessed before. Psychologists have developed new theories and approaches to the emotions, such as appraisal theory and componential analysis. Anthropologists have examined emotional life in a wide variety of contemporary cultures. In sociology, in political science, even in economics, emotions are now recognized as playing a crucial role. What is more, neuroscientists have made enormous progress in mapping, thanks to highly refined instruments, activity in the brain that corresponds to emotional arousal. And researchers in all these disciplines have become increasingly sensitive to the possibility that emotions vary and are not simply hardwired, as the expression goes. Take the achievements of neuroscience. It is an extraordinary feat to observe that neural activity in various regions of the brain correspond, if not always precisely, to the arousal, say, of anger in a subject. And yet, what if anger is conceived and even felt or experienced differently in different cultures? We know of some societies that repress the expression of anger, others in which displays of anger are more acceptable. And the kinds of things to which anger is believed to respond, whether insults, for example, or injustice, or pain, or frustration, they too may not be uniform across cultures. If this is so, then perhaps the neural activity associated with anger, or with whatever word is used for anger in the relevant languages, will also vary. And if so, then neuroscientists have something to learn from social scientists, historians, and even from classicists like myself. Now, in case you are wondering how differently anger can be understood in another culture, let me just mention very briefly that Aristotle, who has given us the most detailed analysis of emotions in the ancient Greco-Roman world, affirms that you cannot be angry at someone and afraid of that person at the same time. Now, this certainly seems an odd claim. I don't know anyone today who agrees with Aristotle on this. So is Aristotle simply wrong? That's what I thought until I reflected that Aristotle was not describing anger exactly. He was describing orge, the Greek word that we translate as anger. But what if orge had somewhat different connotations than our anger? And that if we consider the way Aristotle defined it, that conclusion would follow quite logically, that you can't be afraid of someone and angry at the same time. And that's how it turned out. I would love to have put Aristotle under one of those scanners and see what regions of his brain lights up when he was irascible. Well, so much for Aristotle. Today and tomorrow, as I mentioned, we will be hearing about emotions and the overall idea of emotion as they were described or not described in classical Sumerian, Akkadian, Hittite, Egyptian, Mayan, and Japanese. Each of these areas presents problems of its own in respect to sources and interpretation and much more. My co-organizer of the colloquium, Kuri Virag, and I have been delighted and very grateful that 6 such distinguished scholars have agreed to share their expertise and wisdom on this question with us. Together with last year's sessions, this is, I believe, the first such colloquium to address this question across so many linguistic traditions. But you are surely eager by now to hear from our experts, and so let me introduce the first of our speakers, Gary Beckman. But just let me say that after each speaker, who will go on for half an hour, there will be 15 minutes for questions and discussion. Those who are participating in webinar mode, that is, apart from the speakers in the conference, may pose their questions via the Q&A function, which I will monitor. And so, Gary Beckman is George C. Cameron Professor of Ancient Near Eastern Languages and Cultures in the Department of Middle East Studies at the University of Michigan. He has published widely on Hittite religion and on Hittite social organization and diplomacy. The focus of his current research is the reception and adaptation of Syro-Mesopotamian culture by the Hittites. His most recent books are The Babylili Ritual from Hattusa and The Hittite Gilgamesh, that came out in 2018, an edition of the tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh recovered from the site of the Hittite capital. He will speak to us today on Hittite conceptions of emotion. And so, Gary, take it away.
Hello, everyone. I hope that I can be heard correctly. So what I'm really going to be speaking about is examples of Hittite expression of emotion rather than their conceptions, which I think, since they didn't write things like Aristotle did, it was really inaccessible to us. So the study of emotions from psychological, medical, sociological, art historical, and philological perspectives has become quite popular in recent years. One of the results of this research has been the recognition that the structure of feeling, to borrow a term from Raymond Williams, of one culture is not strictly commensurate with that of another. In the case of ancient civilizations known to us solely from textual sources, where immersion of the observer in the social context is impossible, it is yet more difficult to appreciate the nuances of emotional lives and their expression through language. Nonetheless, if we do not assume approximate equivalence of terms appearing in these sources to those in use in our contemporary idioms, we find ourselves unable to draw any sense whatsoever from our material. I will be speaking today about the state and civilization of Hatti, which dominated what is now central Turkey from the 17th through the early 12th centuries BCE. Although Hatti's administrative language, which its speakers called Nasite, but which is now referred to as Hittite, is the earliest attested member of the Indo-European family of languages, Hittite culture as a whole was an amalgam of many and varied influences. These included the language and customs of the pre-Hittite Hattic population of Anatolia, as well as of those who spoke the other early Indo-European idioms of the region, Palaic and Luvian. While the former tongue died out early in Hittite history, to be preserved solely in a few incantations embedded in Hittite language rituals, the latter only grew in importance over the centuries, seemingly, excuse me, my telephone is ringing, seemingly displacing Hittite as the language of the general population of Central Hatti. Consequently, over time, please leave a message after the tone. Sorry. Consequently, over time, Luvian loanwords appear ever more frequently in Hittite texts, often marked as such by gloss wedges. To these vernaculars were added elements derived from the Hurrian culture of northern Syria and from the ancient civilization of Mesopotamia, based on the Sumerian and Akkadian languages. The written sources, affording us a view of the range of emotions experienced by the Hittites, are the thousands of clay tablets and fragments inscribed in the cuneiform script borrowed from Mesopotamia. These make up the royal archives, recovered chiefly during the ongoing excavations at the capital, Hattusa, the contemporary village of Boğaz Kale, formerly Boğazköy, about a 3-hour drive east of Ankara, but also on a much smaller scale from digs at other sites throughout central Turkey and northern Syria. It is most important to keep in mind that the Hittite archives were compiled solely in support of the political, religious, and administrative activities of the king and his extended family, whose members came to comprise the state bureaucracy. That is, there are but few records pertaining to the activities of those Hittites living and working at less elevated levels of their society. Nonetheless, a wide variety of texts is available, a collection of laws, narratives celebrating the deeds of the monarch, letters exchanged between the ruler and his subordinates, as well as with foreign potentates, instructions for the duties of royal officials, programs outlining the performance of ceremonies of the state cult, hymns and prayers to the gods, recipes for magical rites, belletristic literature, and so on. Although the archives of Hatti contain at least some material composed in each of the languages mentioned earlier, this study will focus solely on texts written in Hittite. Since my prior engagement with the topic of emotions in Hatti consists primarily of a lexical study of the words expressing moods, feelings, and attitudes in the Hittite language, I will not be discussing situations described in texts that clearly demonstrate the acting out of emotions, but that do not employ the relevant technical terms. For example, nuggets such as the following excerpt from a Merchen will not be included. A man named Apu had been unsuccessful in fathering a child. Upon arising one morning, his wife questioned him, "You have never had success before. Have you been successful now?" When Apu heard this, he replied, "You are a woman and think like one. You know nothing at all." Obviously, Apu is lashing out in a rage, but none of the many verbal expressions for anger are present in the passage. Neither Hittite nor Luwian has a cover term for emotion or emotions, but the seat of feelings is indicated by Hittite istanza, written usually Sumerian with a Sumerian ideogram Z, meaning soul, spirit, mood, or mind. This may be demonstrated by a text containing instructions for temple personnel. I quote, "Is the mind, Z, of a mortal and that of the gods somehow different? No. In this respect, no. Rather, the mind is identical. When a servant stands upright before his master, he is washed and he is put on clean clothes. Either he gives the master something to eat or he gives him something to drink. And because the master eats and drinks, his mind is relaxed and he thereby feels attached to the servant. But when he is neglected, is he not displeased? Is the mind of a deity somehow different?" A contrasting emotion is indicated by the same term in an excerpt from a letter written by a man who has just received disturbing news. "In regard to this matter, my mind or mood has descended to the dark earth," that's the underworld, "and I emit a cry of woe to the gods above." I will now present passages illustrating the presence or expression of various emotions, cautioning the listener that several lexemes have often been grouped under a single mode of feeling, since making finer distinctions among these words may not yet be possible at this stage of our research. To begin with anger, the Hittites have left us many records of the oracle consultations they performed in order to discern the cause of divine displeasure that had manifested itself in some illness or misfortune afflicting a member of the royal family. Such procedures involved the posing of yes or no questions before the performance of the divinatory procedure, An excerpt from one such inquiry reads, if the Cowrie sun god is angry with the queen solely due to this matter just discussed, and the deity is not also angry with the queen about something else due to these people, let the lot oracle be unfavorable. Ancient Anatolian healing rituals generally featured analogies drawn between the posited cause of the patient's suffering and the materia magica that would be destroyed in the course of the rite. An incantation explaining the intention of the action almost always accompanies and explains it to the client, to the unfavorably declined deity or force of nature, or indeed to the entire cosmos. An example, come in, O protective deity of the hunting bag, be gentle to us, be pleasant to us, let go of anger, ire, and rage. Just as this brushwood has been swept away before the plowman, so may the anger, ire, and rage disappear before the protective deity of the hunting bag. In a royal prayer, the monarch praises the special qualities of the solar deity. You, O sun god, care for and take pity on the person with whom the other gods are angry and have abandoned. A library catalog lists the incipit or title of a tablet that has as yet unfortunately not been recovered. One tablet on which 3 rituals are written. If the deities Hebat, Sharoma, and Alanzu are angry with a person, that's the end of the catch line. Now on to compassion, mercy, and pity. A further passage from the prayer to the sun god mentioned earlier continues the king's blandishments. O sun god, my lord, just lord of justice, king of heaven and earth, you rule the land. You alone dispense victory. You alone are the just deity. You alone take pity. You alone act upon invocations. You alone are a compassionate solar deity, and you alone take pity. The just person is dear to you alone, and you alone exalt him or her. In the Anatolian myth of Ilyanka, the human son of the storm god calls out to his divine father, who is attacking the family the son has just joined through marriage. Include me with them. Do not take pity on me. Then the storm god killed Ilyanka and his own son. King Morsili II of the Empire period records the reaction of his father, the warrior Suppiluliuma I, upon receiving a request from the widow of Pharaoh Tutankhaten for the hand of one of his sons in marriage. Then my father was compassionate. He took pity in the matter of the woman and concerned himself with the business of a son. In a treaty with a vassal, the same Hittite ruler reminds his underling of previous favorable treatment. I, my majesty, took pity on you, had mercy toward you at that time, and made peace with you. And as I, my majesty, took pity on you and made peace with you, you shall now obey my commands. Queen Putuhepa prays to a junior deity, requesting that he intervene on her behalf with his parents, the chief god and goddess of the Hittite pantheon. You, O storm god of Zippalanda, my lord, transmit for me this word that I, Putuhepa, your servant, am making as a plea, and forward it to your divine parents. O God, my Lord, show mercy to me in this matter. Envy and malice. In a letter, a correspondent explains the resentment felt by another concerning his exile. Then he became resentful about that matter. If someone else had deported your household, wouldn't you have been resentful? This matter has become a grievance for me as well. Rehearsing the boons that his patron goddess had provided him during the earlier stages of his career, King Hattusili Hattusili III recalls, while king of the city of Hakpish, I then became great king. Furthermore, the goddess Shaushka, my lady, placed the envious people, the enemies, and my legal opponents in my hand. Arrogance. In this passage from a military ritual, the Hittites provide their gods with a justification for the invasion of a neighboring territory occupied by a troublesome tribal people. Now the Kaskians have taken possession of them, that is your lands, and the Kaskians have become arrogant. They praise their own power and strength and belittle you, O gods. The testimony of a bureaucrat in a legal deposition concerning his trip to Babylonia includes his confession of sloppy record keeping. I sealed the wooden tablets in my possession concerning the horses and mules. But while I was traveling to Babylonia and while I was coming back, I didn't continue to seal them, nor is the receipt sealed. I was negligent in that matter alone. When the horses and mules arrive, I will seal them accordingly. It is my arrogance. It is not a scheme on my part. Hostility, aggression. An account of the history of the Old Kingdom describes the demise of a usurper to the Hittite throne. Siddhanta became king, and the gods sought vengeance for the blood of Pisheni. The gods made his son Amuna his enemy, so that he killed his father Siddhanta. A hymn to the goddess Ishtar speaks of the hostility she can arouse even among brothers. The brothers became hostile and no longer plowed the field acre by acre. They quarreled with one another. King Suppiluliuma, whose compassion toward the Dowager Queen of Egypt we have already learned about, reacts badly when the son whom he sent to her was assassinated. Then the Egyptians came and pleaded with my father for a son of his for kingship. But when my father gave them a son of his, they took him off and killed him. My father opened hostilities, went into Egyptian territory, and attacked the land of Egypt. In a ritual context, a Hittite ruler relates the kind of support he has come to expect from the chief male deity of his state's pantheon. This city was aggressive toward me. I invoked the storm god, my lord, and the storm god, my lord, carried out my wish. He brought my wish to fruition and turned the city over to me. I devastated it and sanctified it so that in the future no one should inhabit it. Fear. The annals of King Morsili II provide this account of the surrender of an enemy polity in western Anatolia. Then the population of a land attacked by the Hittite king took fright, and the elders of the land came before me and fell at my feet. In a mythological context, a deity scolds another god for having frightened his household staff by his brusque behavior on a visit. Why did you come to my house in anger? So that quaking seized the house, and fear seized the servants. In a prayer of King Hattusili III, the monarch explains just how, as a junior member of the royal family, he had been alarmed at the initiative of his brother, King Muwatalli II, to transfer the state gods from the traditional capital to a new center, but had been powerless to prevent the move. The resettlement of the gods was not acceptable to me. In regard to that order, I was frightened. An ancient myth relates the terror of the moon god upon his fall from the heavens. When the moon god had fallen to the earth, the storm god saw him and released the rains behind him. The rains he released behind him. Afterwards, he released the winds behind him. Fright seized him, fear seized him. Respect. In his summary of his political career, excuse me, the usurper king Hattusili III brags about the acceptance he enjoyed from the other major rulers of his era. Whatever king owed me respect, indeed respected me. Pledging allegiance to a newly installed king, a bureaucrat who had been raised in the royal household makes the following declaration. When the brother of his majesty was king, I was a lord, and I was loyal to him. I did not offend against him in any way, but I was loyal to his majesty, my lord, with all my heart, out of fear or respect and gratitude for nurturance. Anxiety and worry. A scribe working in the capital appends a note to a letter dispatched to a provincial center, assuring his colleagues stationed there that his family in Hattusa was thriving. This is sort of a postscript. All is well here in your household, so my dear brother should not worry. Once again, in a royal prayer, the suffering king pleads to the sun god, I cannot overcome the agitation in my heart. I cannot overcome the anxiety from my body. An incantation embedded in a healing ritual invokes an appropriate analogy for recovery from an anxiety attack. They get the angry man drunk with beer and his anger ceases. They get the anxious man drunk and his anxiety ceases completely. A final excerpt from a prayer to the solar deity describes the effects of acute anxiety on the king. In the face of illness, my house has become a house of anguish. And in the face of anguish, my mind is seeping away to another place. I have become like someone who was ill in all seasons, and now my illness and anguish have become great. Depression. A fragmentary ritual includes this passage. Then the ritual practitioner speaks the name of the person she is treating, saying, may the sun deity above perform an extrication for this purpose. May he loosen the illness of the head. May he loosen the croaking of the throat. May he loosen the burden of the mind. Joy. In a prayer, King Muwatalli II sets forth his enthusiasm for carrying out the rites for his patron deity. As for me, your servant Muwatalli, my mind will rejoice within me, and I will exalt the storm god of lightning, my lord. And you, storm god of lightning, my lord, will rejoice in the temples that I will create for you, as well as in the rites that I will perform for you. I want to be joyful in giving to the storm god of lightning, my lord, the offering loaves and libations I will be delivering to him. I don't want to give begrudgingly. Love or favor. In his autobiographical account, King Hattusili III enthusiastically describes the course of his marriage to Puruhepa. At the command of the deity, his patron deity Shaushka of the city of Shamuha, I took to wife Puruhepa, daughter of Pentipshari, the priest. We set up a household, and the deity gave us the love of husband and wife. Then we produced for ourselves sons and daughters. Another deed of the goddess Ishtar is recognized. A man and his wife who love each other and bring their love to fruition. That too has been decreed by you, Ishtar. In a prayer directed to the chief female deity of Hatti, the goddess is complimented. You alone, O sun goddess of the city of Arena, are a merciful deity. You alone. You alone take pity, and the just person is beloved to you, to the sun goddess of Arena alone. So this concludes my sample of passages involving the vocabulary of emotion. Now to draw some preliminary conclusions. In the material assembled here, we can recognize the full spectrum of emotions attributed by Hittite authors to themselves, to other humans, and most interestingly, to their gods, whom they obviously conceived of as superpowered and immortal versions of themselves. Indeed, it is members of the divine world who most frequently are afflicted with anger in our material. This reflects the basic Hittite conception that the misfortunes suffered by men, women, society, and the state had been visited upon them by the gods in response to some infraction on their part. Similarly, it is the powerful, deities or human kings, who are usually mentioned in connection with compassion and mercy, since they were the one in the best position to act upon such feelings. On the other hand, envy and malice are exclusively directed by humans against their mortal peers, because it would be outrageously presumptuous for a man or woman to focus such emotions on members of the pantheon. The particularly pernicious attitude of arrogance is a manifestation of just such emotions that violate these strictures of deference. But hostility usually arises between earthly individuals or groups, often because of competition within the human sphere. Fear and anxiety may frequently strike humans of any rank, but they are mentioned in connection with the mighty gods only in mythological narratives. Respect, the operational realization of fear, is called for from men and women in regard to both their human and divine superiors. Chronic affliction with fear and anxiety, depression, falls only upon humans, while joy and love and favor may be experienced by and between people and deities. The Hittite archives were compiled over more than 4 centuries, but it is not yet possible to discern any significant development in the structure of Hittite emotions over this period. Indeed, from a materialist perspective, structures underpinning Hatti may be observed, and no change in those structures may be observed, and no significant alterations marked Hittite religion and ideology in the documented period, so we would not expect much evolution. Nor can we yet untangle the web of Hittite culture so as to assign the origin of any particular manifestation of feeling to one or another particular cultural constituent of this complex amalgam. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very, very much. This was a wonderful introduction and overview. We already have a question from the Q&A, which I will read aloud to you, and you can see how you'd like to respond. And others in the panel of speakers can join in as well if they have comments. The question here is there a correlation between hostility and violence?
Sometimes.
It was the nature of the question.
That is, the Hittites attacked the people who were hostile to them in the passage I read to you.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't really have many descriptions of inner thoughts of people, other than in this apology or life story of King Hattusili III, where he attributes all opposition to him to envy at his success. And indeed, at the end of the story, at the end of his tale, he tells how he had dispossessed his naysayers and those who had charged him with various offenses from which he was cleared by a trial before his brother, currently the king, that he took half of their possessions and gave them to his patron deity.
I have a question, Gary. In Greek sources, both the philosophical descriptions and narrative accounts, pity is often specified as being deserved only by those who are not responsible for their own misfortune. That is to say, pity is for undeserved or unmerited misfortune, not any misfortune at all. And in this respect, it differs from, let's say, modern conceptions of empathy, which can be extended even to people who don't, who have in some sense earned their bad situation. But we don't, there's not that element of moral judgment so closely associated with empathy as there is in the Greek conception of pity. Do you find any comparable idea of this moral substrate of certain kinds of emotions?
Well, particularly for pity, no. We have a number of prayers to the Hittite gods by kings, and they all feature requests from the deity for pity, or for the word I've been translating as pity. And all of them also include confessions of bad things that were done by the king himself, by his relatives, or by the state.
That's an interesting feature. Yeah. Are there other, oh yes, there are several questions. Let me just take a look. Here's one that asks, is emotion gendered in the Hittite corpus? Who cries, for instance? Are there certain emotions considered bad for everyone to feel, or for specific types of people or subsets of society to feel?
Well, we really don't have a Hittite Thersites. We don't really have all that many narratives about ordinary people. Both male and female beings sometimes cry, but even gods sometimes cry.
In the Greek tradition, there varies. At some periods, men are represented as shedding tears, and in other, that's for example in the Homeric epics, and then in other periods, these very heroes are regarded negatively for showing a kind of effeminacy in themselves and style of emotion. But there we can track certain responses over time. Is weeping one of those areas that we can tell anything about in Hittite, or not so?
Not really. People weep when they're injured. It's clearly they're not happy, but we don't really have. Well, they cry for woe, as that fellow who got the bad news that I read to you about. Whether that involved tears, but we know that they did cry. One of the things that is called upon to be removed from a sufferer are tears.
Okay, we have another question now. It's two questions. Can we historicize emotions when we only have access to their expression in text, for examples, but not how they were conceptualized, defined, or understood? And how do we know that Abu, apologies for the pronunciation, was in a rage when he replied to his wife? If I'm correct, he did not say that we were angry or in a rage. How is his rage Hittite, or what makes his rage Hittite? So there are two questions here. One is about how we can understand something about the emotions in different contexts when we only have access to their expression, but not how they were defined. And then that second one about the rage.
They're very good questions. We can't really. We translate these words by reading a text about in which they're used. And since we have no one to ask what they mean, then we just decide how we would express that in our language. And that now becomes the meaning of that word. And we look at all the passages where that word occurs and decide whether we need to modify that definition. But who knows whether, just as you were saying about asking about empathy as opposed to pity, how would I possibly able to, well, I can tell you I can't possibly discern that distinction in the kind of text that I have.
Yes, I would just say that I think the two go together, that if we do have definitions, we want to see whether they're right. And then we test them against the expressions. If we see expressions, we see if we can find in some of the literature something roughly like a definition or a more precise description. So I wouldn't say they're alternative ways of approaching emotions, but they're used in tandem. I'll interrupt the Q&A questions. We'll come back to them, but Curie Virag has her hand up. So Curie, would you ask yours?
Thank you so much for your really fascinating lecture. I was just wondering about, you began with a statement from Raymond Williams about structures of emotion or structures of feeling being incommensurable between one culture and another culture. And I was wondering, since we're all speaking in English and we have to use English terms and categories, whether with any of the emotions that you discussed, you had a sense that English word was not capturing, right? So any particular example where there was a split between what the English term conveyed and what you actually saw in the text. So it's as a sort of very rough approximation of that emotion.
Yeah, not really, because I just I can't really get into the minds of the ancients. So yeah, I find this a very difficult topic to address in the terms that, say, David is able to do, where he's got Aristotle who's explicitly discussing these things. These with the Hittite texts are very straightforward. They are basically so the king and his bureaucracy can do their job. There are a few belletristic things which are, as far as we know, were just used for the scribes to practice. And most everything is broken pretty much. So the king hears some news, he gets mad, and he does something.
I have a question that might, from the Q&A, that might bear on what Curie just said. In one of the passages you read, there were 3 words that sounded like synonyms.
They were, yes. We don't
Anger,
really.
ire, and rage.
Right.
Are there differences between these in Hittite? That was
no. We don't have enough passages to discern. There's one word which meaning anger, which is thought to be, one study has suggested that it is pure unexplained anger, that is, as opposed to another verb which seems to occur only in passages where something happens and somebody reacts with anger, whereas the first word, we have it in lists of words to get rid of, things to be gotten rid of by magic, but otherwise the only place it occurs in a narrative, it occurs in a story about a god. Just begins, so and so was angry, and it doesn't say why. So and so the god was angry.
Another question from Q&A seems to bear on this, which is, do we know of any instances of emotions caused by the gods, or perhaps by fate?
Well, joy, the person who was, the king who was looking forward to carrying out his religious duties, both he and the deity were going to enjoy it. Same word is used for both of the parties there.
Mm-hmm. And I see among our speakers, Nicholas Carter has a hand up. Nick?
Yes, thank you. Just like to say, I only wish I had your kind of ample corpus to work with, but I have a question that's related to some of the others about fear. In one of the passages you read, there seemed to be a distinction between fear and fright. Someone was experiencing fear, and he was also experiencing fright. And I wonder if there's an understood distinction between these two terms as they're translated into English.
No.
Okay.
They didn't want to translate two different words, meaning fright, meaning fear, with the same word.
Fair
So but the same word meaning fright can mean startled. There's a ritual where the practitioner hides a couple of birds in a sack or something, and then she's purifying the royal couple of evil influences, and then suddenly she opens the bag, and these birds fly out, and it says they get frightened. So I would probably translate that they're startled, as these birds aren't really going to hurt them. so, and then the word respect, and it's almost always the same word for one of the main words for fear, and the word for respect are the same. You respect the gods, and you respect their commands, and you fear them in a you can fear a human enemy with the same verb.
Very interesting. I think we have something similar in classic Mayan, although our evidence is much sketchier.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
So there's no separate word for awe or reverence?
No, it's the same word meaning fear.
Mm-hmm. Same word. One more question from the
It's largely the same thing in the Hebrew Bible.
I think you may be right there. We would have to ask our Françoise Muguet to confirm this. She was our authority last time on emotion terms in the Bible,
Mm-hmm.
Hebrew Bible. But you very well may be right. In Greek, it's there are some differences, but some words which are said to be divided that way, awe versus fear, very often seem to overlap. So there too, we have some difficulty being sure. Another question is just a very general statement. So maybe it's by our first person who asked the first question. So maybe emotions are universal, but the emotional norms are cultural and historical. That looks like a question addressed to all of us. And did you want to say anything about your view on the basis of the Hittite materials, Gary?
Well, what is meant by norms?
No.
How others react to you showing that emotion?
Hmm.
Or in what circumstances you would feel that emotion, and how that might differ in different societies.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly the second would be true. I mean, I'm not going to go out and walk down the street naked. I'd be ashamed. Whereas in other societies, people don't worry so much about that. Or if I went to a nude beach in Germany, which I had done, I didn't feel peculiar or self-conscious while I had no clothes on. But so situationally too, even within a society.
Yeah, there's in the definition, the concept of anger that I was pointing to, Aristotle very narrowly defines anger as a response to an insult, a put down, diminishment, a belittlement, very specifically, leaving out many other possible sources of this. One of the consequences of limiting anger to an insult is that the kinds of things we sometimes think we might be angry at couldn't possibly arouse anger. So, for example, you bang your foot against a table, and you might think you're angry, but you can't accuse the table of insulting you, and right. So it doesn't work. And so I would say here, we don't have just social norms. We have ways of looking at, conceiving, and packaging the emotions that just may look different in different places.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, we are coming to the end now of our discussions of Gary's paper and getting prepared now to move on to the next topic. which is going to be Egyptian emotions, ancient Egyptian emotions. Next door, after all, since we've already seen that there's even something of a potential betrothal, along with an assassination of relations between Egypt and Hittite world. So I want to thank Gary very enthusiastically for this presentation, which has been for me extremely illuminating, and introduce our next speaker. Emily Odell is Professor of Humanities at Parami University in Myanmar, the former Burma, and has taught Egyptology at Columbia, Brown, and Harvard. She's also served as the Whitsley Chair of History and Archaeology at the American University of Beirut. She's held professorships in Oman and China, and has been a research fellow in Islamic law at the Yale Law School. In Egypt, she was the chief epigrapher for the Brown Cairo University Epigraphic Survey at the Giza Pyramids. She is the author of The Gift of Rumi, that's the subtitle is Experiencing the Wisdom of the Sufi Master, a book that has gained widespread readership, and her latest publications are on Kumzari, the only Iranian language spoken exclusively in the Arabian Peninsula. And so, Emily, let me give you the floor, turn on your camera and your microphone, and take it away.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and I'm so honored to be here with all of you. Thank you for inviting me, Professor Konstan, and NYU for making this event possible. I'm going to share my screen in a minute, but I just want to give a brief kind of transition from Gary's talk to mine, because I think some very interesting points of connection were raised that you'll see emerge in my talk. And also the first question of our event about emotions, are they immaterial? And I think you'll see in the Egyptian example, we might conceive of them as material. Gary also brought up illness, anguish. I'm going to, at the end of my talk, ask, is something like depression framed as illness, for example? Also, Gary used the word attitude for arrogance. I think we might want to think about, is arrogance being framed as an emotion? Are we seeing it as an attitude? How do we think of arrogance? And the question with hostility and violence, I think you'll see also in my talk, represented embodied in a determinative, which I'll explain. And the question of awe is one that I've been working on myself, and I'm looking forward to us contemplating together. So I'm going to share my screen. And the study of emotions, as Professor Konstan mentioned in his opening remarks, garnered the attention of scholars in ancient studies, for example, of classical Greece and Rome, but Egyptologists lagged a little bit behind in pursuing the concept of emotion in ancient Egypt. And Egyptologists, more or less, assumed that the ancient Egyptian terms relating to emotions neatly corresponded to our own categories of emotion. But as I found out when embarking on this research for my dissertation, I only had to open up a dictionary to see how many of the words for emotion had question marks at the end of them. So you could see that there was this struggle of Egyptologists to kind of translate these words having to deal with emotion into English, or maybe an uncertainty, for example. So the nature, meaning, variety, and societal controls of emotion were taken to be self-evident and were not really foregrounded and studied as things worthy of study within and by themselves. Just saying good morning to everybody, wherever you are, or good afternoon and good night. So I'm going to explain a little bit, very briefly, each section, and my time is so limited, I will not get everything in, I am sure, but I will attempt to. I'm going to begin looking at, as the title of my talk is looking at, the study of emotion in Egyptology. How does this emerge as an object of study? And then show you some determinatives to look at how these words for emotion are determined by the determinatives at the end of the word, and what that reveals maybe about ancient cognitive processes and associations. I'll talk about some of the lexicons I drew upon and then created for words of emotion, and also determinatives, and then look at emotion in context in the literature. So I'm going to start with us considering the historicization of emotion in ancient Egypt, but also in Egyptology. When I came up with the idea of my dissertation of emotions in ancient Egypt, and I'll explain how that came about, because in doing this historicization of the study of emotion in Egyptology, I had to think about how did this come about? And also, why hadn't it come about beforehand? So I think when we look at our disciplines, it's important to look at the nature of them, the construction of them. You can see her on my slide. I have a picture of, Egypt as a colonial discipline, as usually a white male discipline within the context of imperialism. So there's the context of patriarchy, which becomes important when I show you my influences. And so what I've been studying is how Egyptologists and historians of the ancient Near East constructed or denied the emotional interiority of ancient Egyptians. And can it be linked to these greater contexts and historical processes, which I think it clearly can be. So about a century and a half ago, the Swiss historian Jacob Burckhardt said, writing a history of the development of the ancient Egyptian mind is an impossibility. So I've been going through these texts and looking at how that inner world of the Egyptians was imagined or denied. What I found particularly interesting was the history of Nazism in Egyptology. And that was Thomas Schneider was a visiting faculty member at Brown when I was a graduate student, which opened my eyes to this history of German Egyptology. And what are the legacies that we inherit from, for example, the colonial context, and also in this case, Nazi Egyptologists about the ancient Egyptian worldview and emotional palette. You can see here this quote, which by now you've probably read. But understanding the nature of a people, I'm moving my little box, of a considerably different race is impossible. So then it was impossible based on race science, race ideology. There's a Nazi Egyptologist, however, who refashioned ancient Egyptians as Nazi subjects and kind of projected that race ideology onto them. So this is what I've been researching is this discourse around the inner world of Egyptians in these different contexts. And I just want to say, Egyptology is still wrestling with its kind of neocolonialism, imperialism, with kind of, let's say, scandals even in popular media about how are Egyptologists dressing? Are some choosing to dress in colonial style? And so that's still an ongoing kind of conversation in the public realm. So when I was a student at Brown University doing my dissertation, we had a visiting lecture from Orly Goldwasser, who was looking at semantic determinatives. I'm going to show a little bit of her work and what a determinative is, and how then I kind of decided to dive into emotion based on that. There was also a graduate student at Brown, Kelly Diamond, who was writing her dissertation on mourning and mourning rituals. And that kind of struck me as interesting. Oh, interesting. I hadn't thought about that before. In terms of in the classroom, I had a professor who, when he talked about ancient Egyptians, would say, my Egyptians wouldn't do that, or my Egyptians would do that. And there was a sense of possession, of ownership, which I think we could even look at our own American race history and politics around that. When I decided to look at emotion in ancient Egypt, somebody then said to me, oh, you have to find David Konstan in classics. He's doing emotion in ancient Greece and Rome. And I was so happy I was directed to him, because there was nothing really done holistically, comprehensively in Egyptology that I could build upon, or a lens through which I could look at this object of study. So I really used a lot of his scholarship and continue to be so grateful for that. So trying to understand the nuances, texture, and landscape of ancient Egyptian emotion was, I conjectured, perhaps one of the last frontiers in trying to understand ancient Egyptian culture, how they felt in their world, how they embodied emotion, and how they used language, not just to convey emotion, but also to embody emotion. And so ancient Egyptian literature, of course, language, but literature also helped me to try to access those ancient samples of emotion. I attempted to excavate and extract ancient emotions from representations in specifically hieratic and demotic narrative and poetic papyri, and to create a nuanced, as much as I could, emotional landscape to illuminate how the ancient Egyptians imagined emotion. in my trying to historicize, how Egyptologists have dealt with emotion, I've started to look at different translations of the same text and how they change over time and kind of inject what become kind of modern ideas. So this is an earlier translation, for example, friends of today don't love each other. A later translation becomes friends of today have no compassion. Kindness has vanished, becomes compassion has perished. So something very interesting has happened there. Is it just a simple way of updating these concepts or making them more poetic, or is there something else at work there? So I think that's something to me that's become very interesting. I'm gonna, I should also mention all these samples of emotion, as Gary kind of gestured towards, these are being written by, elite scribes. Very small percentage of the population was literate and was male. And so who are they writing for? And then also who's been studying it, right? Would also be, for the most part, men in academia. So determinatives, I have to explain to you, what is a determinative? So a determinative comes at the end of an Egyptian word, and it gives more meaning to the word. It gives another shade to the word. So if I was going to spell David, for example, I would spell David and at the end put a little seated man. And that's telling us, I would spell it phonetically and then put a seated man. That's telling us some extra information about David. If I did that for myself, I would then put a woman after the name. It's giving us more information. So this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about determinatives. This is Orly, who I was really instrumental in carving out determinatives as an object of study and as category makers. And when she gave her talk, there was a little bit of a kind of a denigration of cognitive processes as an object of study. That this is not something Egyptologists do. And we once had a chair take over in between our chairs, who was a dean. And she studies Germany, and she said, "Oh my God, the only thing I can compare your education to is 19th century German education, because it was still kind of pedagogically and in the curriculum stuck in that period of time." But Orly really kind of pushes in her research and continues to this. Let's look at these determinatives. What are they telling us about cognitive processes of the ancient Egyptians? When she gave that talk, she mentioned anger. And in her publication here, she mentions to swell like this Nile pufferfish. And that really got me thinking, oh, wait, anger, what about all the other emotions? And what if I, for my dissertation, collected every sample I could find of the emotions and try to come to some conclusions? So the Nile pufferfish, she brought up in her publication. And we have this determinative that comes at the end of words for emotion, hand-to-mouth determinative, right? Kind of a tasting. It's used for senses and emotions associated with eating, drinking, thinking, feeling. So not just feeling, but also thinking and eating and drinking. These are just some words of the emotional categories. We have anger, grief, joy, love, hate, fear, envy, greed, and arrogance. And again, Gary mentioned arrogance, and I think that's really something for us to think about. Is arrogance, is it an emotion? Was it seen as an emotion? So I'm going to have us look at some more of, maybe I'll keep that up while I just mention some of this. So we have to also recognize that once a determinative became attached to a word and recycled as a unit with that word, that determinative became inevitably associated with its phonetic counterpart and its emotional meaning, thereby sculpting and influencing reality and cognition, and of course, these associations. So to do this work, I tried to collect all the words I could find in Middle Egyptian, Late Egyptian, and Demotic for emotion. And after collecting these, I put them in their respective categories. Some of these you can see here, and tried to create a catalog of terms for emotion in Egyptian through these different language stages, including also Semitic loanwords, which appear really starting in the New Kingdom, and in the Third Intermediate period, I collected from there. And that to me was very revealing and interesting, especially with words related to compassion and mercy. And then the second phase of my research was to look at emotion in literature and context, embedded in narratives and embodied by characters. And I think you can also see, and I'm going to show you a number of determinatives, does this make emotion material? in response to the first question we had of our symposium here. So I'll show you some of these determinatives. The bad bird determinative tends to be used for words that were bad. We call it the bad bird determinative. Usually words you could see here with sorrow, misery. So this is an interesting kind of, like when Professor Konstan brought up moral judgment, this somehow, cowardice, bad, anger, bad, hate, bad, sorrow, mourning, sadness. The bad bird kind of gives us insight into that. And I just want to say this is not included in my, I just want to show you what the bad bird looks like, the little bad bird, but something I've been thinking about is aloneness in my research. What does it mean to be alone in the ancient world? And apparently that's bad. So that's just something I've been also researching. The hair determinative is used for mourning. And of course, somebody asked in the last talk about tears and crying. And in ancient Egypt, we have paid mourners, which is something to consider. But the hair determinative is used for mourning. In terms of the dimensions, contours, and geography of grief, I'll bring this up because it was mentioned in the last talk. The text I surveyed implied that women and young adults are not well suited for grief. Further, the gods are appealed to in an attempt to relieve grief, both on earth and in the afterlife. No one was immune in Egyptian society and mythology from experiencing grief or sadness, as pharaohs, gods, goddesses, and common people alike could suffer from grief and sorrow. The pharaoh could cause, prevent, and suffer from grief, while gods and goddesses in New Kingdom literature find themselves plunged into profound grief. And also that can be a bit satirical in one text. A few texts acknowledge the difficulty of expressing and communicating grief through language and rhetoric, while several others present personified landscapes engulfed in widespread mourning. So I think that's something to think about too, is emotion just human? What about animal emotions and also landscape, the emotional texture of landscape? So grief and mourning in ancient Egyptian literature are triggered by death and loss, while sadness is triggered by a variety of factors, such as homesickness, disobedient children, false imprisonment. And grief is also cited as leading to a loss in appetite. So this kind of somatic connection, we might think about that too. Crying, because crying was brought up in the last talk. There's a number of words that describe the action of crying, and those are not all related to grief or sorrow necessarily. The book roll determinative here is used to convey abstract concepts. So that's why it accompanies many words for emotion, which we might then, infer being conceived of as abstract. But for the most part, it's used for positive emotions and pleasure. There's a little book roll. I was giving you time to find that if you wanted to. As for the ear, nose, and cheek determinative, this was usually used for happy expressions, usually joy and happiness. So this is so interesting that those ones are ostensibly being the ones that display on the face, perhaps. What could bring happiness and contentment? Well, since beer was brought up in the last talk, beer, bread, well-populated cities, even steady manual labor, and conditions thought to nurture joy and happiness: wearing fine linen, relaxing in the shade, drinking alcohol, parenthood, the smell of myrrh, the perfume of lotuses, the clearing of the sky, sitting under an awning on a windy day and celebrating New Year's Day. And following one's heart, obeying one's heart, was thought to lead to satisfaction. Wealth, however, I have not found an example, was not a precondition for happiness. Pharaohs in the literature are portrayed as deriving happiness and joy from the collection of tribute, the killing of enemies, military victory, war plundering, drunkenness, and the entertainment of little people. The pharaoh was responsible for bringing joy to the entire land, and his victories and godlike nature could inspire waves of joy throughout the entire population and land. Even the two banks of the Nile expressed joy towards the pharaoh. And the army is depicted as deriving joy from dividing up of property, while subjects of the pharaoh can claim to bring joy to Egypt single-handedly because of their success in opposing rebels and enemies. It's not just limited to Egypt, obviously, in the context of war, in terms of the joy of the Egyptians in war. For Nubians and Asiatics are also portrayed as joyful at the prospect of dividing up Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period. The gods could experience joy. Heaven itself could erupt in joy. So it wasn't just restricted to mortal bodies and earthly land. Gods asked the pharaohs to rejoice over their own beauty, and they in turn rejoice over the victories and building feats of the pharaohs. But also ancient Egyptian literature warns about the dangers of pleasure, such as the ability to distract the mind and focus of a student, of a scribe. And also, one should not rejoice over that which has not yet happened, for no one knows what tomorrow will bring. There's also the phallus determinative, which is used primarily for cowardice, lust, passion. Passion becomes an interesting question in translation. Burning passion, there's a word comes a little bit later for burning, to burn with passion. And the man with stick determinative, this relates to the question about hostility and violence. This is used in words with some element of force, effort, strength, and usually for anger and aggression. And I think that's something for us all to contemplate, is this sense of effort, force, if we find that in any of the other languages. Fear was brought up in the last talk. I think we'll find that in all of our talks, that many samples of fear. So the landscape of fear in ancient Egyptian literature is very diverse and comprehensive and includes samples of anxiety, cowardice, worry, terror, and panic. It's portrayed as a reaction to an imminent threat, which may be real, perceived, or imaginary, such as in the case of nightmares. While the spectrum of fear in human beings can range, of course, from mild caution to paranoia, there's no examples of paranoia. Cowards are likened to dogs. Brave men are compared to lions. Cowardice is portrayed as an act of retreat, with the leg determinative going backwards, while aggression is considered an act of bravery. So we might also think about emotion and motion in this case. And anxiety could, and also with mourning, I should just say, they use a leg determinative, the idea that the mourners were in motion. So interesting, in a funeral procession. Anxiety could affect those with wealth and those with no possessions. And it was also thought, like I said in the last example, to be generated from looking too far ahead into the future, or even the following day, or one's preoccupation with one's job. So there's a number of examples of the physiological effects of fear, such as fight or flight, the act of trembling, a flushed complexion, his face became white, and a desire to hide. Fear could make the heart itself quake or tremble, and could be even felt in the bone or in the marrow. And gods, pharaohs, and armies could be agents of fear and inspire fear in foreign lands. In national calamity literature, fear pervaded the whole is portrayed as pervading the whole land. And pharaohs and gods were mostly attributed with acts of bravery. Sailors and men of the court were also portrayed as brave. However, I couldn't find an example of women being brave, so we also have to consider the gendered dimensions of fear and bravery. And I'll just show you here the Seth determinative. We have here the god Seth, agent of chaos, is used for words about suffering and affliction. Also, crocodile determinative can be used for words about fear. In terms of wrath, the flamingo is used as a determinative. Flamingo is red. Wrath, rage was associated with the color red. And also the vulture determinative determines several words for fear. And here's the crocodile determinative for to terrify or for dread. This is interesting. This is for to hate or to detest. So several texts mention hatred directed towards abstract concepts such as life, death, and evil. It's universally condemned, as far as I could find in ancient Egyptian literature, except in cases where it's directed towards one's enemies. Hatred between Asiatics and Egyptians is portrayed as mutual. Egyptians frame the Asiatics as inherently vile and therefore deserving of hatred. You know, we always say vile, the vile Asiatics is the adjective used. And one was thought to be vulnerable to a death by the thing one hated, and even hatred of objects was not tolerated. Hatred towards incriminating documents, remedies, matters of the pharaoh, and one's own family, strongly discouraged. It's also portrayed as the foreboding entrance of a crocodile. There's an element of impending doom in terms of hatred. And again, I could find no examples of women and hatred. Women are punished for adultery in some stories, but their abuse or death is not couched in a language of hatred, such as towards their gender, for example. And scorn or hatred of one's master was also condemned. And one could not hate the gods, of course. So this bullhead determinative is also used for anger as well, for I think obvious, it's the aggressive bullhead determinative for obvious reasons. The Egyptian script is in many respects a linguistic landscape populated with metaphoric, iconic, phonetic, and semantic structures and signifiers. It's here in the determinatives themselves that emotion, culture-bound meaning, and ancient cognition have become fossilized, petrified, and preserved. You know, I don't have so much time to go into the intricacies and nuances of shame, arrogance, and pride, so I'll just make some general remarks that as for shame, characters in the stories, for example, don't make amends by apology, nor do they offer compensation to rectify or absolve what we would see as modern day a sense of shame. There are no examples of vicarious shame where one feels shame on behalf of another, nor any examples of religious shame or guilt. It's not about a character flaw or moral failing. In the majority of the examples, characters might find themselves in humiliating or embarrassing situations, not really a fault of their own. They're victims of forces such as magic, bad luck, and not really responsible in an individual sense in finding themselves in that situation. And it's also, I would say, connected to and magnified by how one relates in status and reputation to those in front of whom one is humiliated or ashamed. I'll just say that shame then in this sense, and this is building on Professor Konstan's work in Egyptian literature, emerges from specific acts or events, not from the contemplation of a future and permanent loss of honor or status. It's not really about the kind of the individual subjectivity in the modern sense as we conceive of it, at least in English as I'm speaking, and let's say in American culture, because I'm speaking in America, whatever that is. We have multiple cultures. So while modern psychologists today believe that shame is necessary in the early stages of socialization, and even ancient Greeks viewed shame as fundamental to ethical behavior, there's really so far no evidence in literature that ancient Egyptians considered it to have a value as a deterrent to unethical or immoral behavior. Arrogance. I'm so glad Gary brought up arrogance. There's several examples of arrogance in ancient Egyptian literature, and I've kind of been plunged into studying arrogance and awe recently. And there's no sense of a positive sense of pride, for example. I think Professor Konstan's work shows how that's very much kind of a modern concept in many ways. For example, classical Greek also devoid, right, of a basic emotion term for pride in a positive sense. I will say, okay, I think because my time's running short, I'll just say in terms of the concept of pity and compassion and sympathy, this is a very kind of complicated terrain to get into. One's heart could feel sorry for another. One's heart could be sick or painful for another. But I've had to track over time where this kind of emerges, how it changes, and then track how Egyptologists use these terms, interpret these terms. Is it pity? Is it compassion? And Professor Konstan's work has looked at pity versus sympathy versus empathy. I would kind of put this in the pity camp, but this is a bigger discussion than I have kind of the time to do right now. There's also the weary man determinative, and I'm putting this here because I'm going to show you a very recent unearthed fragment that gives me something to think about. So this is the weary man determinative used for feeling distressed, downcast, faint of heart. So how do we, in terms of modern pathology, how we pathologize emotion, what's sadness? What's depression today? And then also, how do many people project those ideas onto the ancient world? And is that fair? Is it not? So one of these texts that has often been invoked by Egyptologists for perhaps sadness or depression or suicidality in the ancient world is a Middle Kingdom story, The Dispute Between a Man and His Ba. This is, even as I was looking online, included on websites for the history of suicide. It's kind of one of the earliest, perhaps, articulations of this. Then there's a debate among Egyptologists, is it suicide? In very simple terms, in the version we have had until several years ago, until fragments were found, there is a man expressing extreme distress, and his Ba comes out, the Ba bird, the soul, and has a dialogue with him. No, don't think about death. You're here now, you're living. Focus on life. And so many of us have taught this, and I just taught this text this week in Myanmar, in Burma, with my students. They liked it very much. So this becomes really, there's a lot of talk of sorrow, and a lot of times sorrow can be triggered by injustice. So that's something to think about too. Are we in our scholarship linking emotions to things like injustice? There's evil in the land, can't trust anybody. Okay, so the Ba bird, this is just showing the Ba bird. All right, but recently, in 2017, some fragments were published of the opening of this story, and we didn't know the opening. We just kind of thought, okay, it seems to be a man talking to his Ba, but in the opening it appears there's an audience, and some Egyptologists have suggested, was this performed? And an audience meaning that the man is seemingly in conversation with, including a woman. So everybody's like, this is so shocking. Not exactly the context of how we were all thinking about it. And what's very interesting about it, to me, in terms of emotion, is that a seated man determinative, usually there's the Ba bird with sick as like in terms of a verb, let's say, but there's what seems to be a seated man determinative, and it becomes the sick one. And it seems that he's complaining a lot about injustice in the land. This text suggests, this publication suggests, is it about a loss of a wife, loss of property? What is the genesis? We don't know. But what's interesting to me is the sickness does seem to be psychological in nature, and he is referred to as the sick one. So when does an emotion become illness? And I remember Gary mentioned, I think, illness, depression, anguish, right? And a lot of times we've said, no, that's not how they saw it in the ancient world. But here it's so interesting. We have what seems to be a psychological case of extreme, whatever word we're going to use, sorrow, depression, anguish, and using the noun. And that's an issue even today. Let's say somebody says in the past, he's a melancholic, he's a depressive. But today it's more politically correct to say that's a person with depression. Don't make it a noun, right? So I think that's something to think about in terms of language as well. I'm not going to get too much into pity and awe because my time is running short. So I'll just conclude. But this is all work in progress, and I've been trying to look at how in scholarship, okay, if we say, oh, pity doesn't emerge until the 18th dynasty, well, is that true? And kind of looking at and interrogating how people have said when things emerge, and what does the corpus and lexicon say, and how do we interpret these things? So I think we have to be willing, in conclusion, to interrogate our own disciplines and their history and their constructedness, and have some self-reflection about them and our place in them. When I raised this with a group of Egyptologists at a conference I was invited to in Europe, nobody was interested in engaging in that. And I think that's interesting. What's the refusal or hesitance to engage with studying emotion as an object of study in the discipline of Egyptology? And that also, in looking at this history, many new trends tend to come from graduate students, and who's influencing them, how are they learning from each other? And also, as Gary brought up too, the question of gender, the study of gender and the emotions. Is it more women in the academy? It's 3 women that kind of gave rise to my work. It was Orly, Kelly Diamond, and then myself. Is that notable? I don't know, because when we would bring up emotion, it was kind of denigrated as an object of study. And then, of course, looking at the history of, like, for example, colonialism. Who's this written for? Who's it being studied by? Who's missing? Who's left out? And looking at the construction of interiority within the larger web of power relations, class context, for example. And like I said, gender and age. We don't have much on children and emotion or old age and emotional, but there's one text a little bit about that. And that our record is incomplete, as my last example of a man and his boss showed. And that when we find these fragments, they might contribute or change our understanding of these texts and also emotional concepts. So what is it also that by focusing on emotion, we might be missing? Thank you. That concludes my talk, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Emily. This was a real pleasure, and questions are already beginning to pour in. Just as a footnote, when I mentioned Françoise Mirguet's work on the biblical emotions, she is in our audience, and she replies, indeed, the root in biblical Hebrew expresses the full spectrum from terror to reverence. So in this regard, it does seem, as Gary suggested, to be somewhat something like the case for the Hittite concept. It's in breadth. There is a question now to you, Emily, which says, thank you for so informative a talk. Could you please explain why did you include many different species of fish in one of your slides?
Thank you for that question. So I was making this PowerPoint in the context of tracking an ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people. And so I was looking for that determinative, and my attention was pulled, and I thought, okay, I could spend all this time looking for this ancient, and crop it and make it perfect, or I could look at kind of the horrors unfolding that I'm implicated in as an American. So that's why I don't think that's the answer you were looking for, but we are human beings in a wider context of producing knowledge, and my attention was pulled to crop that photo.
I have another question, also from Françoise. Thank you for a fascinating talk. I was very interested to learn about the number of determinatives used for different emotional experiences. If I took notes correctly, it seems that some of those determinatives can indicate a range of experiences, at least according to contemporary Western conceptualizations. For example, the bad bird determinative seems to refer to sadness, an emotion, mourning, perhaps a ritual, trembling, a bodily symptom. Does it suggest that ancient Egyptian does not fully map emotions the way contemporary Western languages do?
Yeah, thank you. It's such a great question. And how, yes, they can be used for a range of experiences, and also like built on top of each other, right? Maybe you can have more than one, which is interesting to show different layers, shadings, inclusions of these associations and representations. Yes, I'm just looking at your question. Yes, it can be used, for example, the bad bird for sadness, for mourning, trembling. So yeah, I don't even know, right? Because it's visual in this sense, how we translate that into, it doesn't map onto our contemporary Western, let's say, languages or understanding of emotion. Unless, of course, we're talking about emojis. So about 10, 15 years ago, I think people started to consider, and I think I put that in my dissertation too, well, are emojis somehow comparable? And now if you see somebody I don't know, if you found in your own mind, if you want to do a little like splat face, if somebody says something confusing, or you might see the crying, laughing emoji, I think that might be something that might be a little bit similar. Do our minds pull up those associations with emojis? So, and also, those emojis don't translate cross cultures. So I had students doing one of these emojis. I think I was in China or Burma, and I thought it meant one thing, and they used it for something completely different. And I was like, oh my gosh, we use it for the opposite. So even emojis are not universal in any way. And of course, even generationally now, they're showing that even between the millennials and the zillennials, they're like having different fights about what an emoji means. So I think that's kind of a little bit of our modern example, maybe.
One quick point in our last colloquium a year ago, Maria Haim pointed out that in the Sanskrit tradition, there are many, many elements that go into the construction of an emotion. And if you put them all together and take all the possible combinations, you get thousands of emotions. Now, it would seem that one of the functions of these determinatives could just possibly allow us to nuance emotions by associating an emotion in a given context with this particular determinative rather than another. That's at least a possibility.
Yeah.
Let me go back to, oh no, unless you wanted to answer. This is a question that looks exactly the way mine just proceeded. It asks, are emotions a finite number? How many in the entire range? If it's a question addressed to you, then I'll let you answer, but it obviously has occurred to all of us.
Yeah, I think it's a great question and something we've all been thinking about. And that's why, you know, with the arrogance one being included with that same determinative, well, should that then be included? You know, again, but that's like why we have to go back to studying, you know, the idea of emotion as a discursive category. Who's making these calls? How, on what basis are we making these calls? And also Professor Konstan and others have looked at kind of the neuroscience of certain emotions, right? Are we wired for certain emotions? Or have we not even contemplated the wiring of, for example, arrogance or awe? Many of those studies are about fear, anger, when we talk about the brain. So yeah, is it a finite number? And each place in each language, I think it's different in many ways. Thank you for that question.
Just as a footnote, Phoebe Ellsworth, one of the major figures in appraisal theory today, argues that in fact the emotions are practically infinite in number. And in an ancient text on the Sublime, we have a similar statement. So it's Greek text. Here's a question, another good one. There has been discussion about gendered emotions. Is there any correlation with the gender of related nouns in languages that have grammatical gender? As expected, Romance languages are generally, but not always, congruent, but I can't see any correlation with gender attribution. So this is between,
yeah, it's a great question. I didn't get into that, so I'd have to return to kind of all those samples, but off the top of my head, I don't think so, but that's a great question, something I'd like to look into more. Also, though, it's that many of the, let's say, characters in the text are men. I mean, I know that's not your question, but that's how gender's been looked at. But in terms of the language itself, I don't know if anybody's done that, and I'd have to look at that more. So yeah, that's a good question. Thanks.
Here's another one from Alicia Lemus, who's asked a couple of them now. Thank you. I have one question, and maybe you mentioned it, but I missed it. Although I didn't hear it either, so I agree. Did the ancient Egyptians have a word or words for emotion in general? If so, can you translate to us what they mean? For example, depending on the author, the Romans had a few words that can be translated as perturbations, distress, or diseases of the soul. And is there such a general term, or is it absent, as Gary pointed out for Hittite and Francoise gave for the biblical Hebrew?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's how I was supposed to begin my talk, but then I was so excited to start it with the connections with the previous talk from Gary. So in that spot that I kind of cut out to kind of jump. So in terms of pathos, I give this example in my prepared introduction. There's no word itself, overarching word that serves as an umbrella for the concept of emotion. However, the hand-to-mouth determinative seems to be placing these words in a category. So while there's no word in that sense, I would say, what do we think about that? That there's this determinative being used for words for emotion, that seems to be putting them in a category that we recognize as emotion. So I think that's kind of the deal in ancient Egypt.
Any other questions from our panelists, perhaps? Yes, Curie.
Hi, Emily. Thank you so much for your talk. I was so intrigued by the fact that the ear, nose, and cheek determinative, that was so specifically tied to joy and happiness. Yeah, it's, and I wonder if you could say a bit more about what sense you make out of that.
Yeah, I think
Because
it's,
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
no, it's a great question. And it brings up, like, I think, like, my understanding of emotion is so much about, in terms of my modern constructed self, American blah, 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 woman, face, right? The face, that emotions are displayed on the face, including sadness, anger. Well, ancient Egyptians said that he was raging like a panther. So there's also this sense of, I guess it's like, you get the idea of a face there, but why joy? What about that? You know, and I think that's something to look at as we all study these languages, is where on the body are these being displayed, and especially with the face, and also our own maybe facial bias in our discoursing about emotion, and that it's not necessarily universal, although there's been the study of which emotions seem to be universally displayed on the face in certain similar ways. But yeah, why joy? Why happiness? And also smile. Like, I didn't get into that, but your question's making me think about smiling and who gets to smile. Is, you know, how is that discussed or discoursed? So yeah, I don't know why it's so interesting. I don't know. Yeah, but thank you. No, I think it's really a fascinating point. There are tears, so I could do the corollary. We could look at like tears, but mostly it's just that one is used for happiness. Yeah, so interesting. Thanks for bringing it up.
Well, thank you very, very much, Emily. This was, again, a fascinating survey that is got all of us thinking. And we will now proceed to the last talk of this today's session. Of course, we're coming back for 3 more tomorrow at exactly the same time. So let me introduce Nick Carter, who is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Texas State University. His interests include archaeology, artifact documentation and curation, international heritage, cannibalism and human sacrifice, Maya hieroglyphic writing, secondary polity formation, and ancient imperialism and colonialism. He has published widely on the Mayan language and culture, and most recently, among other recent items, a chapter on terminal classic interaction between Southern Maya region and Mexico in the Oxford Handbook of the Maya. And so might take it away then, Nick, on emotions in Maya culture.
Thank you very kindly, David. I want to start by thanking you and Anna Donch for inviting me to participate in this conference, and in particular, Anna, for her great forbearance and kindness towards me as we've been pulling this all together. I'm going to try to share my screen here because I have a PowerPoint ready to go. Please let me know if you all can see that. Is that coming through?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Well, the great issue about discussing emotions in ancient Maya writing and art is that they almost did not write about emotion at all. Nevertheless, plenty of emotional states come through, at least to my eyes, loud and clear in ancient Maya art and representations of human beings. Let's just situate ourselves linguistically here for a moment, because I'm actually going to draw on several different languages today. Most Maya hieroglyphic inscriptions are in a language which linguists call Classic Chaldean or Classic Mayan. And this is ancestral to a language attested for the colonial period called Chalti, meaning mouth and windpipe, and its modern descendant language, Chorti, which is still spoken in far southern Guatemala and northern Honduras. But at some ancient Maya sites, especially in the western part of the Maya region, we also find terms and grammatical constructions that come from other languages, Western Cholan languages. We also have some documents that are written mainly in an old form of Yucatec, which is the Mayan language that's spoken today, increasingly, in fact, in the northern Yucatan Peninsula. So I'll refer today to words that occur in classic Mayan, in the colonial languages Cholti and Zendal, and in modern Yucatec, Ekchi, and Quiche. So here's just a quick rundown of the culture historical periods for which we have texts in the Maya hieroglyphic writing system. At least based on the extant evidence, the stuff that has happened to survive to the present day, this writing system was at its peak specifically in the late classic period, from AD 600 to about 830. And I say its peak, and I mean in terms of the number of surviving documents, and also in terms of innovations and variety of subject matter, the introduction of new characters into the writing system, the expansion of what it was appropriate to write about. I'll mainly draw on material from that period, but I'm also going to bring in just a few paper books. There are only 4 surviving ones that were produced during the post-classic period after about 900. So to orient us in space, here's a map of the various scribal traditions in Mesoamerica. Writing systems to the east, Maya and Epi-Olmec, emphasize phoneticism, grammatical syntax, and a fairly complete record of a spoken language. Systems to the west, by contrast, are less phonetic, less syntactic, and they function mainly as adjuncts to narrative pictography, giving people's names, the names of places, but most of the action is represented through images. Now, the Maya script may actually have originated in the highlands of Guatemala, this volcanic mountainous landscape to the south, but it seems to have basically died out there at the end of the pre-classic period. And most of the texts I'll draw on come from the southern lowlands. Within that region, writing appears almost exclusively on high-value objects that belonged to a socio-political elite. And I should say that these texts were probably almost completely produced by men belonging to that elite and could have been read and appreciated again by that same group. We're dealing here with things like shell trumpets made from conch, decorated ceramics of which there's a rich and varied corpus, jade items like the dance silt worn on a royal belt for ritual performances at the right. We also have 4 surviving bark paper books, all of which have to do with astronomical calculations and predictions based mainly on a sacred calendar of 260 days, although there are also sections dealing with the movements of planets like Venus, and although colonial Spanish sources tell us that books existed dealing with genealogy and history, none of those survive today. We have also a reasonably sized corpus of stone monuments, mainly on limestone, most of which record royal commemoration of important dates in a separate linear calendar called the long count, which counts forward indefinitely into the future from a date in the very distant past. One thing that almost all of these texts have in common is that they mention the dedication of the objects on which they appear. And this is consistent with a system of production and exchange in which these inscribed objects are made by members of the elite class, and they're gifted to other members, or they're passed up and down in a chain of tribute and largesse, or they remain right where they are, including royal buildings and monuments called stelae, which tend to record calendrical rituals conducted normatively every 20 years in the long count period, long count calendar. To a lesser extent, in the monumental corpus, we read about politically significant events like royal successions and sometimes wars. And in a very few cases, we get biographical information about historical individuals, such as this queen from Piedras Negras along the Usumacinta River in the Maya West, of whom you will hear more later on. We also see scraps of what must have been very complicated religious narratives. We find these on a few monuments and a few painted vessels, like this vessel probably produced in the Mirador Basin, in which a young god transforms into a deer in order to seduce and abduct the wife of an older god, the master of the animal, who controlled hunters' access to wild games. And that is pretty much the extent of the pre-Hispanic Maya corpus of hieroglyphic writing. We have no novels, no diaries, no letters, no grocery lists, not even obscenities scrawled on a wall, as we might at Pompeii. This corpus contains vanishingly few words for emotional or affective states. Almost everything that's written down is in the third person, in the declarative mood, and as I've said, a great proportion of this corpus deals with calendrical rituals, from which we get any historical data almost incidentally. Perhaps the most common theme after the calendar, at least for the monuments, is war. But here again, we find only a very sketchy account of what happened. We learn that some battle was won, or some king fled into exile, but we read literally nothing about why people made the decisions that they did, or how they felt about them. So I recommend to anybody who's interested in classic Maya affective states and bodily experience, a book by my old graduate advisors, Stephen Houston and David Stewart, with the iconographer Carl Taube, called The Memory of Bones. And some of what I'm going to say today derives from their previous work. Now, even if the glyphs are largely silent about affective states, ancient Maya art, especially in the late classic period, is actually extraordinarily expressive and very attentive to emotion, as it's shown through posture, facial expression, and a surprisingly rich vocabulary of conventional gestures, which really almost rises to the level of a sign language. And one of the main affective states that is expressed, unsurprisingly, given who produced and viewed these monuments, is the pride of rulers. They are richly dressed, erect, impassive, looking straight ahead. Nothing could disturb them, and sometimes they're attended by helpers, including people with dwarfism. We find a darker side of this kind of pride in expressions of cruelty, not an animalistic loss of self-control, but rather the contempt and disciplined anger of war leaders who direct the meticulous torture of their prisoners, who, in this mural from Bonampak, are having their fingernails torn out. We see here again the proud, erect posture of lords and kings, but we can also observe their narrowed eyes and their frowns of disgust at their helpless, pleading victims, at their loss of self-control. The pathos of distance, as Nietzsche would put it, really comes through here. Prisoners, meanwhile, appear frantic with pain and fear. Or else, in some compositions, they bear their fate with stoic defiance. But either way, prisoners show up humiliated, bound, contorted, naked, hurt. The jewels in their earlobes have been replaced by paper rags. Other people who underwent physical pain and humbling, as distinct, I think, from humiliation, were young elite men engaged in rites of penance and self-abnegation. And they could expect to come through these experiences perhaps cleansed of their guilt, which they had incurred in some way, or raised to some higher status, or maybe imbued with a new supernatural power, which they could direct on behalf of their people or against their enemies. The faces of these young men seem to reveal sometimes exhaustion, but more often a dignified resolve. The cape of nettle leaves worn by this youth may be uncomfortable, I would imagine it is, but they're nothing he can't handle. And this kind of physical penance is connected to a term that is attested in the glyphs, kab, penance and darkness, which is linked to royal magical potency, and perhaps to prayer and deeply interior-looking states of mind, even meditation, which, however, are not discussed further in the corpus. But a lighter side of things is evident in a few rare jokes, as in this mythic narrative in which the moon goddess's pet rabbit steals the clothing of the god of the underworld, the god of the dead, and then makes fun of his name. Now, his name, properly speaking, is Venerable Penis, Itzam At, but there's a decidedly unvenerating term for penis, Ulis, which the rabbit uses to insult him. Then the rabbit goes and hides out at the court of the sun god. This is, I think, cross-culturally very humorous. We also have some iconography depicting ritual clowns or pat who would imitate, exemplify uncontrolled, wild, disgraceful behavior, both in order to make people laugh and in order to dramatize what kind of behavior was socially unacceptable in classic Maya cultures. On occasion, excess was licensed, as in this case of a group of young men in the grip of drunkenness, having drunk way too much pulque, an alcoholic beverage brewed from maguey, at this elite drinking party. While classic Maya conventions were evidently quite sexually conservative, we do see occasional representations of sexual desire. These are usually on the part of men, with the women either sweetly acquiescing or perhaps resisting, and they're usually displaced onto deities. So the old man embracing the young woman here may be the god of the underworld, she may be the moon goddess, but we can make connections to real people or social stereotypes. In fact, the god of the underworld is the butt of several classic Maya visual jokes, as here when he is leering at a young woman, one among many in his harem. But again, even though all these affective states are evident in ancient Maya art, none of these conditions are actually discussed outright in the hieroglyphic corpus. What emotions are named? Let's start with fear, which is actually an edge case, as we'll see. I think we can establish that there were two different words for fear in classic Mayan. And I think further we can make the case that they have different senses. They talk about what we might call two different kinds of fear. The first of these terms is sah, which I'm translating here as fear. But I think perhaps more precisely we can understand this as a feeling of intimidation, submission, dread of a more powerful person, even reverence and concern about social opprobrium. Now, perhaps this is awkward for the case I want to make here, but we don't actually have a single example of this word recorded. Confidently infer that it existed, at least in Western dialects. The reason for this is that a gesture associated with fear and submission furnished scribes at some Western sites, Yaxchilan on the Usumacinta River, Palenque to the north of that, with an innovative syllabic sign for the sound sa during the late dirt in or over his mouth. But they've taken the sign for earth or ordure and they've superimposed it on this man's face. This actually derives from an artistic convention. Again, it's most common at these Western sites, and it surely corresponds to a real gesture, wherein a prisoner taken captive on the battlefield expresses his subjection and pleads for mercy by raising a handful of dirt to his mouth and smearing it on his face or eating it. We don't find a cognate in the one colonial period Cholti vocabulary by Fray Francisco Moran. Instead, the word in that language for fear is bakat, and that term has cognates in other Cholan languages, including Akalan Chontal and Chorti, but we don't find it in the glyphs. There are cognates to this classic Maya term sah in Yucatec, a noun sah, fear, amazement, menace, a verb to fear, to be afraid of something, and various expressions having to do with fear in social contexts, servile fear, fear that someone causes, and fear as a virtue, honesty, composure, measured behavior. The second fear term is attested in a very few places in the classic Maya corpus, and it also turns up in the Dresden Codex, which is a post-classic document that's actually mostly written in Yucatec Mayan. The Yucatec term is shib. The classic Mayan one is shu. These are cognates, and we can translate both of them as fright or horror. Cognates for this word are widespread in modern Mayan languages, and the root goes all the way back to Common Mayan. Sometimes these cognates work like sa, as with colonials and dal shibanon, to honor or revere a superior or a supernatural being. Or in modern Kekchi, we have shibenel, being startled by someone. And this can actually make you sick with an affliction called kanil, analogous to susto, a folk illness caused by being startled or frightened. But more often, these cognates to shib imply extreme uncanny terror, the kind that shocks you, makes you tremble, makes your hair stand on end. In Ije, the spooky supernatural valences of this root are evident in terms for evil spirits, shibinel, and the underworld, shibaba, the road of fright. Now, in the Dresden Codex, we find this emotion as a noun in two auguries that are associated with certain days in the 260-day calendar. In the first of these predictions, we read, "Death god, moon goddess, it is the evil omen of fright." And the corresponding image shows the moon goddess holding a skeletal god in her lap. This fellow is the standard Kimil death god, who shows up a lot in the Dresden. It's not an optimistic document. Next, we have death god fright. It is the evil omen of white moon gods. Now here, the term shib, fright, takes the place of the moon goddess's name in the previous passage, and a variant of the moon goddess herself, white moon goddess, occupies the syntactic place of shib. And these substitutions raise the possibility that fright is actually the proper name of a malevolent supernatural being. Maybe this is the skeletal god with wild, tousled hair sitting in the moon goddess's lap. The term shib is reasonably well attested in the classic period inscriptions. Unfortunately for our purposes, however, this is not a term for an emotion. Rather, it's a homophone, which means young man, strong man, as in chakship chak, a youthful form of the rain god. I can only find one example in the classic corpus that could plausibly mean fright, and even this one is ambiguous because it's part of the nominal phrase of an elite man, the owner of this polychrome painted plate. Nevertheless, iconography comes to our rescue here again. There is a syllabic sign, she, which depicts a human skull adorned with dots, perhaps spots of paint or spots of blood. We find the same skulls at the base of this sculptured doorway leading into Temple 22 at Copan, Honduras. The sculpture depicts the heavens and the earth and the underworld as the classic Maya understood them. There's a double-headed serpent made of cloud and marked with star signs arching over the doorway, representing the Milky Way at night. This is held aloft by the seated gods of earth, the Bakabs or Kabahtuns, and the sculptures underneath them correspond to what you'd find in the underworld. At either end of this underworld component, we have this same dotted skull. The suggestion is not original to me that there was a classic Mayan word for fear, shiu, shib, which pertained in some way to this dotted skull entity, and that this being contributed its spooky skull to the syllabary as the sign she. So despite the patchy evidence, I think we can suggest that classic Mayan distinguished between two kinds of fear. Fear of a more powerful person, sa, and fright connected to death and the underworld and evil spirits, which seems to be personified in the Dresden Codex. Our next term is lob, which can be translated as woe, despair, or disaster. And again, this has cognates in living and historic languages. In Chokti, there's lobtes, to make ugly, lob, ugly, bad, and lobil, an ugly thing, or the quality of badness. And Yucatec cognates have similar meanings: evil, sin, a bad thing, a scoundrel and a villain, to corrupt or damage something, or to have a sad and heavy heart. Now, this term, in its Yucatec form, lob, appears with some frequency in the Dresden Codex, again in the context of predictions. Here, lob belongs to a category of bad things called muk, which we can translate as evil omen. These muk are likely to occur on certain days in the sacred calendar, and so here the sense of lob is perhaps more like disaster than a felt emotion belonging to an individual. We have it in much the same sense in another post-classic divinatory almanac, the Madrid Codex. Now, the diagnostic component of the lob logogram is the arm bent at the elbow and the wrist, with the wrist brought up to touch the forehead. As it's written in the Dresden Codex, the forehead belongs to a tawny pocket gopher, but he's just there as the syllabic sign, ba. And once again, we don't actually have this word in the classic corpus at all. But as with sa, we do see this conventional gesture in some classic period art. It appears in contexts where persons are feeling sadness and despair at their own misfortune, as on these carved bones that depict the maize god and his animal companions being ferried down into the underworld in a canoe. Or on this panel from the area of Yaxchilan, where a bound prisoner is making the same gesture as he's being presented before the overlord of his captor. And it also appears as a gesture of grief, used by two mourners in a funeral scene on this early classic base from somewhere in Pétain. Well, so much for the depressing side of the classic Mayan emotional vocabulary. Let's turn now to a different kind of word. Different in that this term, tim, has the positive sense of to please or to satisfy. It's something to look forward to. And different as well in that it's actually attested in the classic hieroglyphic corpus. It's the only term, in fact, that's used explicitly to describe someone's emotional state. The cognate root tam is productive in Yucatec. There are all kinds of expressions having to do with satisfying or pleasing or appeasing someone, as well as relieving physical or emotional distress. A lot of these expressions involving tam refer to the heart, or in ways that seem familiar to English speakers. Now, for the Aztecs, there were three vital essences that pervaded the world, and were concentrated in different organs of the body. Tonali, a hot essence connected to perception and divinity located in the head, Iiot, in the liver, a force of animal passions, and Teolia, in the heart, which gave vigor, creativity, personality, and emotions. And perhaps we can see a similar model at work in the classic Mayan text, because there it is never a whole person who is pleased, but only somebody's heart. We have 4 classic period sources for tim, which is 4 more than we have for any of the other words we've dealt with so far. 3 of these are at sites in the Maya West, 2 of them at Palenque, and a third is on a vessel probably made near Motul de San Jose by the shore of Lake Petenitza. In one of these contexts, the meaning of tim is pretty clear. These are fragments of a stucco mural sculpture from the interior shrine of Temple 18 at Palenque. Probably these once depicted the greatest king of that city, Kinicharab Pakal, organizing the order of succession among his 3 sons, who were each intended to follow him and rule in turn after his death. Another figure, presumably a nobleman, says to Pakal, "Your heart is pleased that you set them in order." On the Motul de San Jose vase, a courtier says to his king, "Your heart is pleased," in a scene of elite conference or presentation. Unfortunately, this passage is written at such a small scale, in such a cursive hand, that nobody can really make out the final glyphs. But this visual detail may explain the pleasure of the king's heart. He's got some expensive, labor-intensive items heaped up behind him on his throne, including a headdress and an inscribed ball game yoke, and an attendant is offering him something which looks delicate. At Piedras Negras, 2 stelae give us rare biographical details about a queen, Lady Winika Abajau. She married the crown prince of the site when she was 12 years old, apparently when he already had one wife, and soon after his elderly father passed away. The royal family seems to have been troubled by fertility problems or deaths in infancy, because the only child we know about for her husband was a girl born to Lady Winnie-Kabachau when she was in her 30s. This must have allayed certain fears about continuity in the dynasty, and the king rewards her with a carved stone throne and commemorates her on public monuments. This one shows her richly attired, holding a bundle of costly quetzal feathers. The text is a little ambiguous. We know someone's heart is getting pleased, but is she pleasing someone else? Is she highly satisfied with her gifts? Is she inherently a heart-pleasing person? I think the pleasure is hers, because of an iconographic detail I'll discuss shortly. We find further expressions on one of 3 tablets from the Temple of the Inscriptions at Palenque, the funerary temple of Initxanab Pakal. The first referenced heart-pleasing occurs at the end of a long passage listing rituals performed by Pakal himself during his life, which, we are told, pleased the hearts of his gods. This is pretty unambiguous and unsurprising as these things go. Then the text departs from inscriptional conventions in 2 important ways. First, it uses the optative mood to express hope about the future, and second, it leaves the third person or the second person to address an audience, who perhaps Pakal. This next passage looks forward to a 20-year Katun ending in the long count calendar, an important date, and desires that on that date someone's heart will have been pleased. Then it predicts that someone's heart will be pleased on the next Katun ending after that, 20 years later. This person seems not to be Pakal, but an unnamed royal at Palenque, perhaps one of his successors. But it does seem to address Pakal again with some ambiguous nouns possessed with the second person ergative pronoun, I. And finally, this section returns to the optative mood, wishing that another heart-pleasing event should happen 138 years after that, on an even more important calendrical station, on the throne, on the seat of this person who is being addressed in the second person throughout. So heart-pleasing is the kind of thing that can happen to a living person, a deceased person, or to a god, and it can seemingly result from a wise decision or from receiving an appropriate gift. Now, to return to Piedras Negras, notice that Lady Winnie-Kabachau is holding her left hand in front of her chest, touching her thumb and finger together. The heart-pleased king on the Motul vase is making the same gesture. So is Lady Winnie-Kabachau again on another monument which shows her sitting with her daughter on her new throne. The text doesn't say her heart is pleased, but I think we can infer it. We see similar gestures in other scenes of rulers receiving tribute, as on this vessel, probably from Dos Pilas. Again, it's the left hand in front of the chest, thumb and fingers touching. On this vessel from Nebach, where the spoken language was probably a little different, we see a similar gesture, but this time with fingers outspread in the same kind of tribute presentation context. And again, with fingers touching in this scene in which a lord enjoys some pulque with his attendants. Consistently, this gesture is made by people receiving gifts, usually from subordinates who make other gestures, such as crossing their arms or raising one elbow and touching the opposite shoulder, apparently signs of respect. The sign made by the recipient seems to indicate graceful acceptance of what one is due. And so I infer that Team Ol has 2 related valences in the inscriptions: satisfaction with having made a good decision and set things in order, and satisfaction with what one has been given by a subordinate. In both cases, there is a sense that all is right in the world and social order has been maintained. So to sum up, emotions are far more often shown in ancient Maya art than named or described in writing. Within the visual corpus, you find a very limited range shown on monuments, mainly the stoic dignity of kings and the abjection of prisoners. There's a wider variety on late classic painted vessels. Of the 4 terms for affective states that we can identify in the script, sa doesn't appear as such at all. We can only infer that this existed in the language from a syllabic sign derived from a conventional gesture of submission. Shu or shib is almost as elusive. And in the Dresden Codex, it may actually name a kind of demon that inspires horror, rather than describing the horror itself. Law is better attested in the codices, and it does have clear connections to classic period iconography, even though it isn't written as a logogram in the classic corpus. Only team, pleasure, satisfaction appears in the classic written text. This can be connected to a specific hand gesture, and it implies a feeling that things are rightly ordered, plans for the future have been made, subordinates are paying their dues. Finally, I want to point out the innovative role played by royal courts in the western part of the Maya world specifically. Piedras Negras and Yaxchilan, both on the Usumacinta River, and Palenque to the north of them. These are the only places where Team Ol appears in monumental sculpture, as compared to the one monumental voice from vase from Motul de San Jose, and it's also in this region that the sa syllable probably emerges and becomes more popular. So it may be the case that talking about emotion in monumental context was part of a distinctive regional culture, something which was not done at places to the east. This possibility deserves further investigation because we also find linguistic variations in that area, divergences from the conventional ways of speaking and writing in the heartland of northern Petén. I apologize for going slightly over time, and I hope that nonetheless I've managed to please your hearts.
Thank you so much. This was a genuine pleasure. I suppose you can, yeah, that's right. You can move out of the shared screen mode.
Thank you for your indulgence.
This, what you have made of the sources you have is simply extraordinary, and I know we're all grateful. It's time for questions. I don't see any question at the moment coming in from the Q&A. I'm sure they will come in very briefly. Does anyone on the panel have a comment to make? Yes, John.
Thank you. That was such an interesting talk, Nick. I was looking at the hand gestures having to do with pleasing of the heart. I noticed, although the location at the body seemed to be very similar from one to another, sometimes the finger positions were a little bit different.
Yes, they are.
So I am wondering, is it, on the one hand, excuse me, could this be a moving gesture that's being captured at different times? They understood what the gesture was, so it doesn't have to be exactly the same because the actual gesture is a moving one. Mm-hmm. Or could this be suggesting nuances of emotions that they would be able to read? Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, I think it may be a moving gesture, but I'm intrigued by the possibility that there are further nuances that might be caught, for example, by the orientation of the hand. I noticed that when it's a male ruler making the gesture, the hand is up like this. And in the cases where it's the Piedras Negras queen, both times it's down like this. And this might reflect differences in status relative to the person who is giving the gifts, because the queen is receiving gifts from her, lord and husband, and the rulers are receiving gifts from subordinate lords. There is actually a very complex traditional sign language used among Quiché Highland Maya people, which is used by hereditary class of slaves so that they don't disturb their masters by speaking in their presence. So I think there's all kinds of nuances and details that are probably represented in these scenes, maybe in analogous sign language.
I think that question is part of a piece of the puzzle where watching you work, and as David said, you get a lot from what you've got, and I'm thinking about how you're. Of course, if I sat down and looked at the same imagery and told you what I thought it meant, it would be so off target because I have no knowledge of the culture. I have no knowledge of how all of these facial expressions interact with one another. And it seems to me that that you've developed a contextual expertise that you can move around in that when you see a particular image, you know more because of the larger context that you're bringing to the image rather than the specifics of the image itself. Is that right?
Yes, I think so. It's really just a matter of looking at thousands of these images.
Yeah,
It's
thousands. Yeah.
unfortunate we don't have more in the text, but the iconography almost compensates for it.
We have
Yeah,
questions. I'm sorry, go
yeah.
ahead.
So that the thousands I think is the key here. I think if you had 10 or 20, no, but it's as we get closer to the big data area where you can begin to actually get a little universe going there. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Sorry for the spam call in the middle of my talking.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt, but there was a question from the Q&A. Has anyone tried to compare emotions described in ancient sources to emotions in contemporary tribal societies? That, of course, is something that you were doing, Nick, in looking at still spoken languages. Before I pass the floor over to you, I would give an answer that explains why we chose to pick languages that survive in classic and ancient scripts. We did so because we were of the topic before emotion, which suggests a kind of chronology. And so we looked to cultures which we could properly describe as ancient. If we were to look at so-called tribal cultures or cultures that, let's say, are, well, maybe that's the best description, it would be suggesting that somehow these were fossilized ancient experiences, and that we have no reason to believe. Well, there's modern ways of understanding emotions across the huge number of languages that survive today, and we wouldn't want to classify them as in any chronological way to suggest that somehow advanced more than others. So we, for that reason, chose to concentrate on these much more difficult cases to analyze, where we are dependent on surviving scripts and iconographical materials and other types of things. Now, Nick, did you want to add a comment to that?
Yes, in a way, I regret that I'm constrained to bring in so many cognates from modern and historically attested languages, but I do think we can see a kind of intellectual genealogy in the way that people think about emotions, even if the value of sheep, for example, is not exactly the same in modern Quiche or Quechua as it is in classic Mayan. And yeah, it's difficult in the case of the classic Mayan language because we have so little written, and yet I think you can see certain ancient dichotomies between, for example, being intimidated and respectful on the one hand, and being startled and maybe made ill by an experience of fright you had on the other hand. One thing that occurred to me is I wonder, and this is kind of directed at Emily, whether we can see similar kind of connections between ancient Egyptian emotional vocabulary and terms for emotional states in Coptic, for example.
That is indeed a fascinating point of comparison. It really,
I don't know a word of Coptic myself.
well, it is, well, but you never know. It is, it's just one of those possibilities that is suggested by bringing together these various expertises, which are mutually illuminating. Are there other questions from the Q&A or from the panel? We have 5 minutes left, and we have been very strict and rigorous in keeping to our time. Let me remind everybody who is tuned in that once again, tomorrow, we will have a session at the same time where we will hear from experts in Sumerian, Akkadian, and Japanese, Again, rounding out, this will now be an even dozen languages if we put together the previous panel and this one. We do plan to publish the proceedings at a decent interval where people can reflect on what we have been doing and hearing. So we can look forward to that. Are there any other questions in the last 2 or 3 minutes? Yes, there is one. One, I wanted to thank you for an impressive talk. This is to you, Nick, an expansive approach to understanding other cultures. And then the last, well, there is a technical question. Is it the same Zoom URL that we will be on tomorrow? I believe that it is the same one. If not, information will be circulated, but I believe it's the same URL. And then the final question is, have we changed at all from what our speakers know? Have there been changes? Oh, no, I have, excuse me, I have a piece of information. It will be a different Zoom URL. That information has just come in from Anna. And so please, everybody be attentive. I take it that you'll need to register separately for day 2. So please, I'm sure that information will be circulated to everybody who was registered for the first, but be attentive to the fact that you will have to re-register for tomorrow's session. And now that last question, have we changed? Did you want to make a comment on that, Nick?
Well, I think that in contemporary Western culture, we have kind of new ways of describing emotion. Kind of a whole new vocabulary gets introduced with Freudian psychology in the early 20th century. We have kind of a new vocabulary that's coming in off of various internet sites and really affects the way that people think about their emotional and bodily experiences. And perhaps I would say that, insofar as ancient languages don't discriminate between what we might call emotional experiences and physical experiences, we may be coming back to that in the way that we conceive of emotions.
Thank you very much, Nick. I want to thank again all the speakers for today, of course, Gary and Emily and Nick. This was, in my judgment, all that I could possibly, and I'm sure Curie agrees with me, that we could have hoped for. I remind everybody that panelists will be checking in a little earlier than the rest of you, but 12 o'clock tomorrow, we begin again. Do take account of the fact that there will be a new URL and you are to register for participation tomorrow, where we will hear people speaking about Sumerian, Akkadian, and Japanese. Thanks to all of you, and have a good day, and see you tomorrow.